Everyone remembers the stone. Few remember the silence before it. For 40 days, one man humiliated an entire army without striking a single blow. Israel knew who Goliath was. What no one seemed to grasp was what was truly at stake. Because in that valley, the most dangerous moment in history was not when David attacked. It was when he spoke. For 40 days, no battle took place. And that was not a detail. It was the strategy. Every morning, Goliath descended into the valley, not to fight, but to speak, to occupy the space between two armies that had already lost before the first blow was ever struck. Israel was armed, organized, numerous, and yet immobile. Because the problem was not the enemy's strength. It was what that constant presence produced within. Goliath did not attack. He exposed. He walked to the edge of the valley and turned silence into shame. Every word was a reminder that no one would cross that distance. Every challenge was a public confirmation of Israel's paralysis. The army was not wounded. It was broken from the inside. The humiliation did not come from defeat, but from repetition. 40 days hearing the same challenge. 40 days watching the same body advance without resistance. 40 days of silence where there should have been an answer. There was no combat, but there was erosion. There was no blood, but fear was accumulating. Saul, the king, was there. The soldiers were there as well. All saw, all heard, and all stepped back. Not because they were unaware of their God's history, but because in that valley, that history felt too distant to cross the present. Goliath did not need to defeat Israel. He only needed to keep it still, and while the giant spoke, the valley ceased to be a battlefield and became a stage of continuous humiliation. It was in this setting, without action, without glory, without movement, that something began to shift. Not in the army, not in the king, but outside the center of the scene. Because sometimes the most decisive moment in a story is not born from confrontation, but from a prolonged silence that no one can endure any longer. Goliath believed he understood the valley. He saw two armies, a safe distance between them, and an enemy that did not respond. To him, that was already victory. Not because Israel was weak, but because it had accepted the rules of the game he imposed. Goliath's error was not overconfidence in his own strength. It was something more subtle. He interpreted silence as final fear, the absence of an answer as surrender. To the giant, Israel had already been reduced to what it appeared to be, a people immobile, intimidated, without a voice. But Goliath was not fighting soldiers alone. He was challenging the identity of an entire people. Each provocation was aimed not only at the army, but at the God that army claimed to serve. Even so, the giant did not grasp the true scope of what he was doing. To him, it was spectacle, public intimidation, psychological control. The valley, however, was not neutral. It carried memory. It was the space where Israel was meant to affirm who it was, and where, in that moment, it failed to do so. Goliath exploited that failure with precision. He did not need to cross the field. It was enough to call someone down. And no one descended. The giant's confidence grew with each unanswered day. The silence confirmed his reading. Israel did not react because it could not, or because it did not dare. Goliath considered no other possibility. There was no miscalculation there. There was an unexamined assumption. He believed the conflict was physical. That victory would come through direct confrontation. That whoever dominated the body would dominate the outcome. That was the error. While Goliath measured strength, weight, and armor, something outside his field of vision was beginning to move. Not at the center of the army, not among the seasoned warriors, but at the edge of the scene. Someone who did not accept silence as a final answer. Someone who did not interpret the valley the way Goliath did. The giant was expecting a combatant. The valley was preparing something else. Because the confrontation that was approaching would not be decided by who shouted the loudest, but by who understood, with precision, what was truly being placed at stake in that prolonged silence. David does not descend into the valley in silence. And this is not impulse, it is decision. Before any stone, before any movement, he speaks. And by speaking, he completely alters the nature of the confrontation. Until that moment, the valley belonged to Goliath, a space shaped by intimidation, repeated fear, and Israel's silence. David's voice breaks that logic, not because it is loud or aggressive, but because it displaces the focus of the conflict. David does not respond to the giant's size. He does not react to the threat. He does not enter the game of strength. His words are not directed at Goliath's body, but at the meaning of what is taking place. He refuses to let the confrontation be defined by sword, spear, or shield. By speaking, he redefines the battlefield. This speech is not youthful bravado. It is not blind courage. It is precise reading. David perceives what no one else had perceived. The problem of that valley was not military. It was spiritual. The challenge was not only against Israel, it was against the God Israel represented, even though Israel itself had forgotten that. When David speaks, he does something dangerous. He binds the outcome of the battle to a name greater than his own. He removes the confrontation from human hands and places it on another level. From that moment on, it is no longer a boy facing a giant, but a public declaration about who governs that scene. That changes everything, including the risk. Because if David is wrong, it will not be only him who falls. His words leave no room for retreat. He does not speak to protect himself. He speaks to commit himself. By naming the God of Israel in that valley, David ties his own life to the truth he proclaims. That is why this is the most dangerous moment in history. The stone has not yet been thrown. Nothing has happened physically. But the confrontation has already been decided on another plane. Goliath laughs because he does not understand what has just occurred. Israel watches in silence, uncertain whether it is witnessing faith or madness. The valley, which for 40 days had been a stage of humiliation, now carries a different tension. Not that of strength against weakness, but of meaning against appearance. Because when David speaks, he does not challenge only a giant. He challenges the way that story had been told until then. That scene was never only about victory or defeat. The valley was not deciding who was stronger, but who had the right to define reality. Goliath believed power was imposed through physical presence, through the repetition of fear, through the absence of response. For 40 days, Israel accepted that logic and paid the price in silence. When David speaks, he exposes something deeper. The true conflict was not between two armies, but between two ways of reading the world. On one side, visible force, measurable, intimidating, undeniable. On the other, an invisible conviction, risky, unprovable, impossible to demonstrate before the outcome. The valley becomes the place where these two visions collide. What was at stake was not only the fate of a people, but the unspoken question hovering over Israel. Who truly governs when fear dominates the scene? If silence continued, Goliath would win without ever attacking. If David's words were wrong, the defeat would be public, total, and irreversible. That is why this story was never comfortable. It offers no guarantees before the act. It does not protect those who speak in the name of something greater. On the contrary, it exposes them. David receives no confirmation, no sign, no visible protection before entering the valley. He simply sustains, alone, what he has declared. At this point, the weight of the story becomes clear. The confrontation does not test courage alone, but faithfulness. It does not measure strength. It measures alignment. The valley ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a silent courtroom where truth will be revealed not by arguments, but by the outcome. The stone has not yet flown, but everything that mattered has already been decided. The stone falls, and the story moves on. But what endures is not the final impact. It is what was spoken before it. Because there are moments when a battle is already decided before the first blow. And the greatest risk is not always found in the visible confrontation, but in what someone chooses to affirm when silence still feels safer.